During the 1800s, the railroad industry was continuously growing and hiring new workers. With the pressure to keep up with the high demand of railroad production and need to make a profit, working conditions were often overlooked. Railroad workers endured long days of hazardous work for very little pay. The railroad employees were not the only victims of terrible working conditions. During this time, factory workers and coal miners also endured atrocious working conditions. The workers finally reached a breaking point, and their anger culminated in labor strikes against the companies. Some of the most notable strikes in this time period included the Pullman Strike, the Haymarket Riot, and the Great Railroad Strike. Railroad workers throughout the country went on strike because of 25% wage reductions, job cuts, and workloads doubling. The violent strikes began in Baltimore and Pittsburgh and spread to St. Louis and Chicago. The mayor of Chicago received reinforcements from the National Guard and Army units to tame the mobs in the streets. The governor of Maryland telegraphed President Rutherford B. Hayes asking for reinforcements to protect Baltimore from the strikers, and Hayes sent 3,700 soldiers. As a result of the bloody battles that broke out between the strikers and soldiers, over 100 died and 1,000 more went to jail. During the strikes, more than half of the nation's 7,500 miles of railroad had been shut down. A small amount of workers were fired, but most were allowed to return to work. The railroads repealed some wage cuts, but most stayed in place, and conditions did not improve greatly. The Great Railroad Strike was very influential in that it served as an inspiration for other workers throughout the country to protest bad working conditions, such as the Pullman Strike of 1893.
The railroad strike itself does not reach success. They don't achieve what they wanted to achieve. And other industries realize that there needs to be more organization and that labor unions can possibly have successes in the future if they're all acting as and with one voice.
Wages fell 25% and employees were injured and killed due to the dangerous working conditions, which led to the Pullman Strike of 1893. Railroads needed help terminating the strikes, so on July 3, 1893, President Grover Cleveland sent troops to Chicago to end the strike. The enraged strikers and rioters then began taking actions such as stopping trains, smashing switches, and catching anything that would burn on fire. Numerous people were killed or wounded. A majority of the workers resumed their work because they felt it would be a lost cause to continue the strike because of the federal interference. The workers received the same wages as before, and some of them were put on a blacklist, which meant that no railroad in the U.S. would hire them. The Pullman Strike was just another strike that influenced the mind of the railroad workers to rebel against their unfair working conditions and outrageous hours, such as the Haymarket Riot. The Haymarket Riot of 1886 took place in Chicago at the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company. The workers went on strike to demand an 8-hour workday, when 60 hours a week was a normal work week. The company locked out the workers and hired strikebreakers to tame the crowds. One man was killed by police during a protest held by strikers. On May 4th, a meeting was called in Haymarket Square to protest police brutality. It began as a peaceful meeting until a bomb was thrown into the crowd by an unknown person, and police opened fire on the protesters. 7 policemen and 8 civilians were killed during the riot. The police arrested 8 bombing suspects, and 7 of them were sentenced to death with no solid evidence of their guilt. The workers returned to work, but their demands were not met until 1938, when United States workdays legally became 8 hours. In 1901, something happened that would change the railroad industry forever. President William McKinley is assassinated, forcing the change of power to new President Theodore Roosevelt.
McKinley was known to be a friend of the big businessmen. As a matter of fact, many of the big businessmen of the tycoon era funded his campaigns. But after he was dead and assassinated, you have Teddy Roosevelt take over, and the very first opportunity he got, he actually stepped in on the side of the worker. There was a coal strike.
The Anthracite Coal Strike was a repercussion of miners working long days of very physical labor in dark, damp, dangerous conditions with little pay or job security. President Theodore Roosevelt invited representatives from the United Mine Workers of America to the White House to negotiate, but their demands were not met. Roosevelt threatened to send military forces to take over and operate the coal mines. As a result of the Anthracite Coal Strike, there were shortages of coal, a 10% wage increase, and a reduction of work hours. Even after this successful strike, the UMWA was still not recognized.
They would blacklist workers who would be involved in unions so that they couldn't get jobs in that industry anymore. They would also, in some cases, try and dismantle the unions if they could, or not hire people who found themselves or decided to join unions. They would also, in some cases, bring in scabs, which were strike breakers, workers who would work for less during the strike in order to keep the factory going so that they could continue making money while the laborers were striking.
The government started as a friend of the company because the company supplied jobs, which boosted the economy. But by the Anthracite Coal Strike of 1903, the government sided more with workers. Many workers were upset with their hours and their working conditions, so they decided to make a pact to go against these conditions. These pacts were called labor unions. When labor unions strike, the industry can do nothing to stop them, and they suffer desperately. The industries are forced to give the workers what they want so they will continue to work and make more money. These labor unions sparked many discrepancies with their industries, and many of them were done within the railroad industry.